Hello everyone, thank you for joining us today. My name is Philip Balakowski. I'm an intern at the Prince Mohammed bin Fahd program in the College of Sciences here at the University of Central Florida. Today, I am joined by Dr. Konstantin Ash. Dr. Ash, who earned his Ph.D. at the University of California, San Diego, is an assistant professor in the Department of Political Science, specializing in comparative politics and international relations. He recently spent time conducting research in Lebanon, the topic of discussion for our podcast today. Dr. Ash focuses on explaining participation in political conflict and violence, ranging from protests and riots to insurgencies and terrorism, and using these findings to make group-level quantitative inferences, particularly with respect to conflict in the Middle East, North Africa, and the broader Islamic world. His published work, which features in International Interactions and Democratization, among other journals, has focused on explaining fragmentation in political protest movements and competitive autocracies, and the rationale for the formation of pro-government militias. He currently has two works undergoing the publication process. One looks at the relationship between the perceived links to political leaders and the feeling of group deprivation, while the other analyzes how political factors influence emotional responses, particularly those of empathy and Schadenfreude, a feeling of happiness at a sufferer's pain. Dr. Ash, thank you for joining me today.
Thank you, Philip, for having me, and the PMBF Center for having me back.
Do you think you can begin by giving us a brief overview of Lebanon's current political system?
So, Lebanon's current political system is actually Lebanon's only political system historically. Lebanon was a country that was carved out of what was broader Syria by the French in 1944. And it is unique because it has a lot of demographic variability in terms of religion that you don't really see as much in that region. There are a lot of Christian, Druze, Alawite minorities in Syria and in Jordan, but the distinction for Lebanon is that at the time, at least, of its independence, it was a country with only minority groups. No group had the majority, so it was a diverse country of Christians, Shia, Sunni, and Druze, along with some other minor sects. So at the time of independence, the French really just wanted to give the Christians as much political power as possible because they sort of had an alliance with them. And they framed this political system that crystallized that power. Essentially, there were elections to a parliament, and there was a prime minister, and there was a president, but informally and formally, the system fixed it so the Christians more or less dominated the system. In fact, the first elections through the Civil War in Lebanon had a 100-member parliament with a fixed distribution of 55 seats for Christians and then 45 seats for Shia, Sunni, and Druze, even though over time the Christian plurality in the country dwindled because of outmigration and higher birth rates among the other sects. Then the other political branches were also distributed favoring the Christian sects. Basically, the president was always to be a Christian based on informal agreement. The prime minister was always to be Sunni, and the Speaker of the Parliament, the person who keeps the Parliament open and running, was always to be Shia.
You mentioned Lebanon's Civil War briefly in that overview. Can you actually elaborate more on the Civil War and the circumstances surrounding it?
So the Civil War kind of came about for a bunch of different reasons. So Lebanon's political system, again, it's a fixed, esoteric type system. People vote for candidates from not only their sect, but also candidates from other sects, but the sects run on broad slates. But broadly speaking, Christians in Lebanon were no longer the demographic plurality. Sunni and Shia populations had grown. They had political demands. There were also complicating factors within sects, basically a lot of political competition before the Civil War. And after the Civil War takes place within Lebanese sects, so you end up having Sunni and Shia and Christian political leaders that are elites that are not representing the entire sect. And then you have movements growing before the Civil War within Sunni sect, within the Christian sect in the form of the Communist Party, within the Shia sect that want to change the political system to something more representative. And what throws a wrench into this in the 70s was the influx of not only Palestinian refugees, they had been in the country since independence pretty much, but the influx of the PLO, the militant wing of Palestinian nationalist movements. And this group leaves Jordan in 1970 and they go to Lebanon, And once they arrive in Lebanon, they start operations against Israel from Lebanon over the border. This creates tension with the government, which is dominated by Christians, which starts violence between Palestinian groups and Christian groups, which eventually forces everybody to kind of take sides into two camps. And so the war kind of precipitated of the fact that the system couldn't really change, that there were all these elites in power in each of the groups, and there was also underrepresentation for the Muslim sects and the Druze compared to the Christians, in addition to the fact that these Palestinian militant groups had come in and sort of stirred the pot. So you have that catalyst in 1975 starting a civil war that's primarily between these right-wing Christian militias on one side and Shia, Sunni, Palestinian militias on the other side. Obviously, the war went on for 15 years and things changed and got more complicated as things went on there.
You mentioned how Lebanon's political system has essentially stayed the same since the country gained its independence. Is there any kind of real lasting impact that the Civil War had on the political system?
So at the end of the Civil War, so the Civil War realistically ended because the Christian militias fragmented. They started fighting with each other. The other militias that were fighting, the Christian militias, the Muslim militias, also fragmented. Some got destroyed. But at the end of the Civil War, to sum things up, a general tried to seize power, Aoun, who's currently the president, incidentally enough. He failed. He was supported by Saddam Hussein. He picked a bad time to be supported by Saddam Hussein because this was 1990 when Saddam Hussein was facing his own problems with the U.S. and the coalition invading him. So he lost that support, and the Syrian government essentially invaded most of Lebanon, occupied the country, and imposed a peace deal. And the peace deal reapportioned some of the seats in the parliament to parity. So essentially Christians got half the seats, 68, and Muslim sects, Shia, Sunni, and then the Druze got the other half. And it also reduced the power of the president. So it was sort of a compromise agreement. With Syria in power, though, that system didn't really work for 15 years. The Syrians ensured that only pro-Syrian candidates won elections. They messed with the borders of the districts, basically and also kicked out all the politicians or jailed all the politicians they thought were anti-Syrian. So for 15 years, the system itself was there. It was in the background. It wasn't really functioning. What the Civil War really did was impose all these different interventions from foreign countries to come in and kind of impose their will in the system.
Speaking of Syrian occupation, how would you say more recent events, such as the Cedar Revolution and the 2008 conflict, continued to shape politics within the country?
So it's a really good question because the Syrian occupation really came to a head with the 2005 Cedar Revolution. All of the politicians they had been repressing, including Aoun, he was forced into exile. In France, another militia leader on the Christian side, Samer Jaja, who had led a right-wing militia, was jailed for a long time. And essentially, these Christian figures started becoming more powerful and coming back either to the fold or through proxies. And at the same time, there's increasing pushback in 2004 against the Syrian occupation from a former Syrian ally, former prime minister for most of Lebanon's post-Civil War history, Rafik Hariri. And so Hariri is actually assassinated by there's currently a trial that is ongoing in the Netherlands that wraps up hopefully this month, which will tell us whether it was those 4 Hezbollah assassins that did it, but more likely than not, it was at the behest of Syria that Hariri was assassinated. And this assassination of a very popular political figure triggered a huge backlash against the Syrian occupation in February and March of 2005 and led to what's known as the Cedar Revolution. It paralleled a lot of the color revolutions that took place in the former Soviet Union. Essentially what takes place here is that a bunch of these protesters, mostly from Sunni, Christian, Druze groups, come together to peacefully call for the end of the occupation. At the same time, Syria is sort of facing this pressure, and the U.S. had invaded Iraq several years before. They believe that, we really should kind of withdraw here and push back. So Syria, within the next month and a half, withdraw all their troops from the country. But the conflict didn't really end there. So once Syria withdrew, they also realized the U.S. wasn't going to invade them because the U.S. started to get bogged down in Iraq. And they started using different tactics to continue to influence politics in Lebanon. They have essentially a close alliance with Shia in the country, represented by Hezbollah, a militia from the Civil War, and the Amal movement, another militia from the Civil War, who still support Syrian influence, at the very least, in the country. And at the same time, they also staged a lot of assassinations against politicians that were anti-Syrian. And you see this 2007, 2008, George Howie, Tueni, all these different politicians from Christian or Sunni groups that were opposed to the Syrian occupation in 2005 start getting blown up, essentially car bombs, assassinations, things like that. So Syria continued to play a role and influenced Hezbollah and the Amal movement, and actually, in a stunning turn of events, Mashar Aoun, who had been exiled by Syria, who came back right after the occupation, had a falling out with the anti-Syrian alliance and joined the pro-Syrian forces with his political party in 2005. These groups essentially locked down the parliament and prevented any action from taking place in terms of government from 2006 to 2008. Protests, sit-ins, things like that. And it culminated in May of 2008 with what was probably the closest Lebanon's come to a civil war since 1990, when the Civil War ended, when Hezbollah occupied West Beirut, the headquarters of the Sunni Future Movement, which Hariri's son was the leader of, and there were battles on the street, essentially between the two militias. It wrapped up really quickly, few days, it was over, there was an agreement, unity government put into place, new elections, all that kind of stuff. But essentially it reminded us that there was this new division, that there wasn't sort of a Christian-Muslim division in the country anymore, that the division was between these Sunni and Shia political factions and Christians supporting one or both sides, about basically how close to Syria did the country want to be compared to other actors in the region.
Can you tell us more about Hezbollah, their role within Lebanese politics, and what their kind of goals are, what they want to achieve?
So Hezbollah is historically a primarily Shia political party and militia. It was founded during the Civil War from people who were disgruntled with the Amal movement, which is a more secular political movement / militia, which was itself founded by people who were disgruntled with Shia elites who weren't really doing anything before the Civil War. So you got kind of this complicated track, but Hezbollah is unique in that it was the only political force in the country after the Civil War that maintained its arms. So they had weapons, and they used them after the end of the Civil War until 2000 and even leading into 2006 to fight the Israeli occupation that took place in the south of Lebanon in 2000. So Israel continued to occupy what they call the security corridor south of the Litani River, which is right on the border with, or right on their northern border and right on Lebanon's southern border. But it did contain a lot of Shia areas. Hezbollah did have sort of popular support, their quote-unquote resistance in fighting Israel. And after Israel withdrew, Hezbollah continued to agitate for some disputed areas, which led to a 2006 one-month war, which if you anybody listening to this podcast has seen the Anthony Bourdain episode, that's where he gets stuck in the country. During this war, it's Hezbollah attacks Israel, they kill 2 soldiers, I think they take their bodies, and Israel, as a retaliation, starts to bomb Lebanon. Mostly Hezbollah targets, but also others. But since then, Hezbollah has reformed itself to some extent. They're an Islamist political party. They fundamentally want an Islamic state in Lebanon, but they've lowered those demands. They function as a state within a state, and they maintain their own separate military group, their own separate phone system, their own separate transportation infrastructure. It's essentially like a little country within the larger country of Lebanon. And the fact that they have their own separate weapons, the fact that they are in effect a fighting force, the fact that they've been fighting in Syria during the Civil War is a real political issue in Lebanon. It's a real hot button issue of, do people support disarming Hezbollah? Do people support Hezbollah as a parallel force for the country because the military is not particularly strong? And the role of Hezbollah is one of the, along with whether to side with Syria and kind of parallel to that, one of the major issues in the country.
So you also mentioned the Syrian Civil War, which obviously is, like you said, a very hot-button topic at the moment. What can you tell us about Lebanon's current situation, including its involvement in the Syrian Civil War?
So the Lebanese government itself probably has very little involvement, but again, we have to, when we talk about Lebanese government, we also have to talk about Hezbollah. And so when the Syrian Civil War broke out, for the first couple of years, Lebanon was mainly impacted by the fact that it was a recipient state. It was right on the border. There was a lot of fighting going on, so a lot of refugees went over. Currently, Lebanon has approximately 1.5 million refugees. Because the Lebanese government was very hesitant and didn't like the Palestinian situation where they register refugees, Palestinians stayed in the camps. They refused to open up any camps and they refused to register any refugees. So it was impossible to know how many refugees there are. And they're not living in any camps, so they either live in existing housing stock or they live in kind of shanty towns. So if you're ever visiting Lebanon, which is a beautiful place, and I do recommend taking a trip there, there are sort of rural areas where you see kind of shanty towns which have Syrian refugees. But after 2013, the involvement ramped up. So in 2013, the Syrian rebels were doing very well. It looked like they could overthrow Assad within months. And this led Hezbollah to intervene on behalf of the Assad government. And as a result of that, the Syrian rebels tried to influence Hezbollah to withdraw. And they did it by staging attacks, suicide bombings, car bombings in Lebanon, in Hezbollah areas. So these attacks took place against the Iranian embassy. They took place against neighborhoods where Hezbollah was supported. And they took place for years until actually in 2014, a part of, not clear if it's exactly ISIS or Tahrir al-Sham or one of the other Islamist rebel groups, actually took over a small town in the mountains on the Syrian border with Lebanon, in Lebanon on the Syrian border. So essentially the war spilled over onto the border. And instrumental in kind of stopping that, functionally speaking, was Hezbollah. Hezbollah pushed back the ISIS/Islamist soldiers. They acted in tandem with the army, but they are also technically the reason that this happened, because their intervention to help Assad really led up to it. But since 2013, Hezbollah and then later Iranian soldiers and later Russian soldiers were instrumental in essentially turning the tide of the war. And now the border with Lebanon, with Syria, is, according to people, I was just there a couple months ago, is no longer militarized. There's no conflict there, and there is a strong push within the country to try to get the refugees that are there to return to Syria.
I'm going to pivot the conversation a little bit so we can actually discuss some of your recent research. As you are undoubtedly aware, both religious identity and clientelism have played a prominent role in Lebanon's political system. Can you elaborate on the roles that both of these things have played?
Absolutely. So these two factors really interact with one another, because the political system creates very little incentive to actually, for politicians to interact with other confessional groups. The way elections work is that there are multi-member districts. Essentially, if you live in a certain place, you get a ballot and you can vote for a slate of candidates across multiple sects, which is set up by the government in advance. Now the issue with this is all predetermined based on a census run in 1932. Why hasn't there been a more recent census? Well, in 1932, the Christians were the majority, and the Christians were the ones in charge of deciding whether to run the census, and they're certainly not going to run the census. That shows that they are no longer in the majority. So we're stuck with that. But more than that, when people vote, they fundamentally vote for the slate, but they are also voting for somebody from their own confession. So they don't necessarily have an incentive to really, in their support, to support candidates from other confessions. And usually in these districts, it's 100% certain who is in the majority, and those candidates are the ones who are deciding who wins from any of the confessions. So let's say you are in a majority Shia district, but you still have some seats allotted to Christians and Jews or something like that. The Shia slate knows it's going to win because it's going to win a majority of the votes. So they can just assign the most pro-Shia Christian candidates possible to run on the other slates, and that's it. So the system is basically structured in a way where all of the competition takes place within a sect. To put it more correctly, it's structured in a way where all the politics is self-contained. So let's say if you're in a Shia district, the only thing that really is going to make a difference is whether you support the Shia party Amal or you support Hezbollah. If you're in a Druze district, the only thing that makes a difference is whether you support the Progressive Socialist Party, which is the more anti-Syrian party, or the Lebanese Democratic Party, which is the more pro-Syrian party. Sunnis don't have any variation. It's either the Future Movement or nothing. And for Christians, there is actual competition as to whether you're on the pro-Syrian side or the anti-Syrian side. But it's not, I'm not, it does get more complicated than this. Because politicians run on these slates, or maybe in tandem with that, the state itself doesn't really work to support the common good. Lebanese public services are not very good, and everybody complains about them. Electricity is not provided to everybody at all times. There are electricity shortages. In Beirut, there's power cuts for 3 hours. Everywhere else, there's power cuts for at least 12 hours. So you have to use generators. Same with water. You can't rely on government for water. Now, why is this the case? It's really the case because once anyone is elected to parliament, and once any group is elected to parliament, they get control of a ministry. And instead of using these ministries to help the common good, they have no incentive to do that because they're just competing for their own sect support. They distribute funds or some kind of private goods from those ministries to their supporters within their sects. So what ends up happening, and this is what my kind of inequality paper gets at, is about 20% of the population from across sects will get access to these private goods. And this could be private hospitals, this could be special access to education, college admission, for instance. There's special slots for political parties where they give access to college admission to their supporters to certain universities. And it can be pretty much for anything, and it's designed so the government is used in a way, this clientelist system is used in a way that only helps members of your own sect if you are from a certain political party. So your religious identity pretty much determines what kind of stuff you get, and what sect you're from determines how much competition there is for your vote. So for example, if you're Christian, there is tangible competition, like the groups will try to buy you off and stuff. But if you're Shia, there's not that much competition because the groups are allies. So you kind of have to like compete for how pro-Amal or pro-Hezbollah you look in their eyes. And if you're Sunni, you really have to compete because there's no competition. It's just one party. It's the Future Movement. So realistically, the religious identity structures the competition, and then the clientelism is then structured in different ways based on that.
Can you explain more how these themes tie into your recent research, particularly regarding how political factors can actually influence emotional responses?
So the political factors paper sort of doesn't tie into clientelism necessarily, but it does tie into a broad phenomenon where we see a shift in how people perceive other sects across time. So during the Civil War, we would have expected Christians and Muslims to be pretty antagonistic toward one another. But what I find, and this is a paper joint with Tom Dolan, another professor at UCF, political science, what we find is that when we randomly induce people to see that members of another sect that are currently their allies suffered violence at the hands of the government, they're more likely to be empathetic. And when they're currently their adversaries, they're more likely to feel Schadenfreude, to feel pain, or to feel pleasure at their suffering. But that same group may very well be a former ally in the past. So for example, Shia and Sunnis are more likely to feel Schadenfreude toward one another, whereas we would have expected during the Civil War that to be the reverse. So really what that tells us is these sort of divisions that we perceive between groups are not at all static, that they can change based on political circumstances, they can change over time, and it's not something we should treat as, okay, there was a civil war between Christians and Muslims in the country, therefore they're going to hate each other forever. It's really something that changes with political circumstances. It depends on a lot of different things, and we should also not treat this as deterministic because these changes are probabilistic. We also see that the more politically engaged you are, the more Schadenfreude you're likely to feel anyway. And that just means that, politicians are more likely to inflame hatred or pleasure at others' pain than among people who are politically disengaged.
We've talked a lot about Lebanon so far, but I'd like to address just why specifically, what is the significance of Lebanon, particularly how the country fits into broader Middle Eastern politics?
So Lebanon it's always sort of a bellwether of what's going on in Lebanese politics to some extent. It hasn't experienced, any conflicts, major conflicts in 25, almost 30 years. But at the same time, it's a microcosm of the region as a whole. So many of Lebanon's divisions we see in Syria. Much of Syrian politics and Lebanese politics tend to interact. Lebanon has millions of refugees. So it can tell us a lot about how these religious divisions and these ethnic divisions change over time, how they're influenced by political institutions, and what solutions for the eventual Syrian conflict's end may work or may not work, because Syria has a conflict that's still going on. It's eventually going to end. There's going to have to be some way of resolving all this intergroup tension. Is Lebanon a model for it? Probably not, but is Lebanon a country that is relatively stable after 30 years of not having a civil war, after a very long and very deadly civil war where a lot of people died? I mean, it can teach us a lot about the successes and failures of post-conflict interaction in this kind of society, especially with a far larger and a far more recent conflict in Syria going on that we're seeing wrap up, and we want to see sort of stay stable for as long as possible afterwards.
What can you tell us about potential changes that will come in the future, especially given the return of Assad as a prominent regional actor?
So I think we're already seeing these changes to some extent because there has definitely been a loss in Saudi Arabia's influence in the country as a result of the growth of Syria and Iran's influence over the country in the past few years. And we saw this last year with a little incident that happened with the Prime Minister, Saad Hariri. So Saad Hariri is the son of Rafiq Hariri. They're both Saudi citizens. They both made their fortune in Saudi Arabia. They have very close relationships with the country. And in October, November, Saad Hariri took an unannounced trip to Saudi Arabia. Essentially, for better to say, for worse, he was kidnapped by the Saudi government, forced to resign, gave a very uncomfortable TV interview. And then eventually, everybody in Lebanon, including the pro-Syrian politician, President Mashid Aoun, leader of Hezbollah, these individuals were calling for his return, embracing him, and eventually he came back, brokered through France. He stayed as the prime minister. He was embraced by these people, but essentially he seems to have had a falling out with Saudi Arabia. So Saudi Arabia's role as a regional actor is dialed back. It seems like Hezbollah, the Ayunis on the Christian side, have a lot more influence. They've won a lot of seats in the most recent election. Now, won is a tricky word because the electoral law was designed in their favor in some backroom political deals, but it seems like the influence of Syria, the fact that Assad won the war, the fact that Hezbollah was instrumental in that, has provided for a lot more political influence for these groups in the country. And for the foreseeable future, it's probably going to be less of a dominant role for Assad because Hezbollah is now a fairly powerful group in Syria for stability, but at the same time, it's still going to be a influential role for Iran, for Syria in the country compared to what it was before in 2012, 2013, when it looked like Saudi Arabia and the pro-rebel forces in Syria were going to win out.
It will definitely be interesting to see how the situation develops into the foreseeable future. Unfortunately, we are running somewhat limited on time, so I would actually like to end this on a more of a lighter note. Like you said, Lebanon is a beautiful country. What would you describe as one of your, favorite or best experiences that you've had during your time within the country?
So I probably won't go into the super favorite ones, but I'll give a shout out to the Roman ruins there, which I think or Phoenician ruins, which I think are the best in the world. You guys should, if anybody is going to Lebanon, visit Baalbek, visit Anjar, visit Sur or Tyre. These are phenomenal. They're well preserved. There are usually very few people there because they're scared off by conflict or whatever, but it's really it's not dangerous. It's fine to travel around. The people are great. It is, for all the conflict and politics that we talked about, it's a great place to visit. It's a great place to spend a lot of time in, and I highly recommend going.
I will most definitely try to visit Lebanon in the future, and I hope all of our viewers do as well. Dr. Ash, it was